Hi, I'm Raphael, and I am here with Linda Colasanti. And I'm really excited about this. I'm extremely grateful to have you here, Linda, because we had a discussion the other day about dyslexia, and I had no idea just how pervasive this is and how it's affecting our families, our children here in America and perhaps in other countries. But you are the expert on that. Now, we decided to name this podcast Dyslexia Challenges and Advantages because they're both eminent. So tell us about your experience, Linda, and what you do, please.
Sure. So, first of all, Raphael, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to hopefully raise awareness and help more people. Um,
Hmm.
that's the end game. So, how did I get started in doing what I do? Um, Dyslexia is genetic and or inherited, and there are two genes for sure that are associated with dyslexia. I think they're discovering, maybe trying to figure out if there are two more. I don't know if they've been discovered yet or not, but that's kind of up for debate. But I'm adopted, and I did not know anyone that looked like me or acted like me until I had my own children. And while I thought that I was not that great of a student, and it turns out that I have dyslexia as well. I did not know that until my oldest was identified. And the reason I say identified rather than diagnosed is because dyslexia was not a medical condition until I believe 2014.
We didn't
And
have a label then.
it did. It's just that it was not placed in the DSM-5. I
I
actually have
see.
behind me
Got
until,
it.
yeah. So in the DSM-4, dyslexia was not in there. In the DSM-5, it was placed in there as a medical condition. Again, this can be good and bad. And I don't want to spend too much time on that. One of the one of the reasons why it can be bad is because you cannot give someone a pill to fix dyslexia. My
Okay.
tagline is the only cure for dyslexia is education. Okay. So to make a very long story short, my older son, who's now 21, was a very bright and curious young child. He went off to traditional kindergarten, and he started to act out in class. He was not interested in his ABCs. And so we ended up having what's called an IEE. It's an independent educational evaluation by a highly reputable doctor in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the first doctor that we saw said, well, he's very smart, but his reading scores are low. What are you doing wrong, Mom? You need to read to him more. I know. And it hurt my heart because I thought, oh my gosh, I read to him for sure every 15 minutes, 15 minutes every night.
Wow.
So we ended up, to make a very long story short, we ended up having him evaluated 4 times. The first 3 times he was misdiagnosed. The second time they wanted to put him on medication, which I hear is very typical and very common for ADD. He does not have ADD. The third doctor said that he had oppositional defiant disorder, which, if you know my child, who knows how he was behaving in, the testing, but he's not that either. So we finally went to this fourth and final person that, in my opinion, is the best in Charlotte, and she gave him a diagnosis of dyslexia. And now, knowing what I know, um, it is it he went through a lot of growth, a lot of personal growth, because it dinged his self-esteem a little bit in his younger years. I very quickly, the first book that I picked up was called The Dyslexic Advantage by Brock and Fernette Eide. They are
Right.
doctors that have researched for 30 plus years the advantages of having dyslexia. And
Love it.
yeah, they're neurocognitive scientists. And And so I made sure that my older son was not ashamed that he was struggling to read. And so that's actually how I got started. But something else happened to me, and that was the fact that 3 highly reputable doctors misdiagnosed my son, not just 1 or 2, but there were 3 of them. And that catapulted me into a space of learning everything that I could about dyslexia. I ended up becoming trained in something called Orton Gillingham. And well, to be very frank, the first time that I did a training that was really for me, I discovered that I have dyslexia because I learned how to decode a word. And the very first word that I learned how to decode was occipital, the occipital lobe in the brain. And
And may I ask about how old were you when you discovered this for
gosh, I
yourself?
was 42. It
Wow.
was about 13 years ago.
So you went through this struggle when you were a child and you didn't know what was going on.
I did it. And I survived as well, which I think a lot of people who have dyslexia, I think they cope and they learn how to figure out. But I'm a much better reader and speaker now, and my life is just easier, even though I have dyslexia. So it also, so this unawareness, I guess is what I would call it, or misdiagnosing by 3 highly reputable child psychologists, it lit a fire under my seat. And I ended up taking law classes, special ed law classes. I ended up doing a year-long practicum to learn how to screen for dyslexia. I was absolutely floored that doctors that I paid thousands of dollars to misdiagnosed him. So, and it was really prevalent. And now, thankfully now, 13 plus years later, we have screeners and I mean, I do screenings. There are apps that do screenings. It does not replace a formal evaluation, but you also need to know who's evaluating you and do your due diligence if anyone's listening. So.
Now, when you took your son in for these 3 evaluation, he was evaluated with 3 different things or twice with ADHD for the first time.
So he was evaluated by 3 different
Mm-hmm.
doctors. They use these diagnostic tests to measure intelligence and spatial reasoning, and the Woodcock-Johnson and Stanford Binet 5, and all
Is
of
that
these.
is that out of the DSM-4 at the time?
Um, good point. Yes. So dyslexia was not in the DSM-4.
Oh, okay.
And so during this time when they were misdiagnosing him and labeling him with ADD or oppositional defiant disorder, dyslexia was not in the DSM-5 yet. The DSM-5 had not come out yet. So to your point, yeah, maybe they didn't have a label.
So he was labeled with ADD and he was labeled with the disorder. Was one of those labeled twice? Because there were 3 doctors and those were the 2
One said his reading scores are low.
Oh, gotcha.
He
And
was
mommy, what are you doing wrong?
right. Yeah, that was the first one.
Okay. So
I was
an education disorder. So excellent. So what do you see going on now in in our schools with you did mention that 20% of the children may have some degree of dyslexia. Is this correct?
yes. So um of course, everyone's slicing and dicing the numbers. It could be 50 to 20% of the population. It doesn't matter if it's alphabetic or logographic. And so logographic meaning Chinese, any symbol, um,
Gotcha.
versus the alphabet, which uses letters. So it really is a mind uh, difference. I hope I'm making sense.
Oh,
I,
totally. And
I was prepared
what do
for
you
that.
what do you see happening in the schools? Do you see a lot of children being, I mean, obviously, they must be being misdiagnosed. Are they, for example, being diagnosed with ADHD? And by the way, I want to point out that back in the 60s, I was actually referred to my father who came to school. I had some problems with school. I was totally not paying attention. I had no problem with learning. I could read before I went to school, but I was just not interested in rote learning. And I saw things that other people didn't see, so I would get up and walk out of class. I was labeled as retarded. And so that's very
It's-
damaging to a child to be called that.
I think that was a kind of a blanket bucket catch-all statement.
Yes. It was not politically correct, but that is the term that they used back in the 60s. And a teacher came up to my father when I came out of the principal's office after spending 2 days under observation. And she said, Mr. Formont, Raphael is probably the smartest person in my class. And by the way, Albert Einstein was labeled retarded when he was Raphael's age. She said, so I wouldn't worry too much about that, which
Oh,
of course threw the parent in a totally disorientated loop. What is going on here and what to do about it? So what do you see happening out there in the schools, Linda?
So since 20% of the population does have dyslexia, in a classroom of 20 students, 4 to 5 will most likely have what's called dyslexia. And dys means difficulty with, and lexia means language. So if somebody is struggling to read, the label dyslexia isn't a bad thing. Hopefully it'll be a directive to push for explicit instruction from the school or even from an outside source.
And tell us about the advantages of dyslexia,
So
please.
I mentioned earlier that the first book that I read was called The Dyslexic Advantage by Doctors
Mhm.
Brock and Idy. I actually am in touch with them still to this day. Um, I, 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 I cannot tell you how much of a fire it lit underneath my seat when I discovered that my older son had been misdiagnosed 3 times.
Mhm. Mm.
Was finally and if I had just given up, I don't know what kind of person he would be to this day. But this is not to toot my own horn. This is to just let you know what I ended up doing. I ended up
And
opening up
let
my
parents know. Yes.
Yeah, I ended up opening up my own business. I remediated my own son. Then I created a grassroots movement called Decoding Dyslexia North Carolina, along with other chapters in other states. I advocated at a national, state, and local level. I would talk to schools and speak in libraries and individuals all the time. Um, I took multiple like law programs, and one of them was through Wright's Law. And so I became really well versed in, uh, parents' rights, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that I discovered that's really missing from what's happening today is making sure that the children understand that they're not broken,
Hmm.
that they really do learn differently than the other 80% that's in the classroom. And it's not a reflection of them and their self-worth. So that's really my mission, is to not only teach parents what to look for, but also to teach children um, and anyone really that has dyslexia how to read. And so that I'm in the process of creating courses that could be sent to prisons and to adults to help them learn how to read, to kind of crack the code. So there's a lot that can be done for these individuals that did not have proper instruction. So back to the advantages. Doctors Brock and Frenette Idy discovered 4 strengths And they use the acronym MIND. And I cannot emphasize it enough that anyone, if their child is struggling to read, or if they discover that they have dyslexia, to go check out Dr. Brock and Fernette Eidy's book. It's been updated. They are literally my heroes. I cannot give them enough credit, because I would not be who I am, and my children wouldn't be who they are without them. So they identified 4 strengths. They use the acronym MIND, and the first letter M stands for material reasoning. And anyone that has that's really good at almost seeing a project that's complete before it even gets started, like an architect or a designer or an interior designer, they have the M strength, which is material reasoning. And a man named Tom West actually wrote an entire book on it called In the Mind's Eye. So we have people who have dyslexia, or the mind strength, or the M strength for material reasoning. They tend to be able to see a completed 3D version of whatever they're thinking of.
So great imagery, imagination is very powerful.
Very powerful. So back to touch on ADD. Now, I have not done any research on this, but these children that have these mind strengths, that may be daydreaming or thinking about whatever they're thinking about, or creating or seeing whatever they're seeing. Exactly. It can look like you have ADD and you're having a hard time focusing. But Raphael, the amount of time that we've spent together, you focus really well. So I'm not sure that I do work with people who truly have ADD. And even that, I can get them engaged if they're interested. So I'm just not sure that, I think the medicine and the prescription of medicine is overprescribed right now.
And I'm not a fan of Western doctors. I worked with the South Koreans for some years on healing yourself. So this is a very important issue, especially for parents. And you've mentioned that some dyslexic people, because of the confrontations they encounter, are being sent to prison. That's a negative effect of mishandling, right?
Well, so let me just very quickly talk about the last 3 of the mind strengths. One is
Thank you.
interconnected reasoning. And interconnected reasoning means that, let's say, like let's see, I'm trying to, like a geologist, or oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Any doctor, what are the doctors that read x-rays? Why am I not radiologist? Let's
Right.
just say a radiologist, or a gemologist, or geologist. What they do, people who have dyslexia in those fields, they can take like ambiguous information and see things that other people don't or can't. It's kind of what's not really revealed to the naked eye. Okay, wait, Jim has this and Susie has this, so possibly there's a correlation.
So they're following patterns very
They're
well.
following patterns, right? Exactly. And they're really good at that. So the other one is narrative reasoning. A lot of authors and actors, Keira Knightley, Jennifer Aniston. Oh my goodness.
Will Smith, Jim Carrey.
Yeah, yes. Okay. So perfect. I'm drawing blanks on all the names. And then the last one is dynamic reasoning. And those who have dynamic reasoning, it's almost as if they take the patterns from the past and then they can predict the future. So a lot of entrepreneurs, obviously Richard Branson, Steve Jobs, Steven Spielberg, although I think he'd probably fall more in the narrative category, they have dyslexia. So
Just
those are
to
the
go
4.
back, narrative reasoning, could you describe that? Is that, for example, bringing to light the images that they're experiencing or
Exactly.
sharing?
It's called episodic memory. People who have good instincts are able to tell stories based on their episodic memory. So
Wow.
they're able to almost walk down the path of the event that happened and then describe it in details.
I love
So
that. I always tell people, tell me a story. They're trying to convey an event and they're giving me different data. And I say, walk through it. Tell me a story. Walk into it and give me everything that you see. That's the best way to convey something. Um, Tell me
you hit,
about this prison thing.
I was about to say, I didn't, I didn't mean to shortcut you. Um,
Okay.
the thing with people in prison is it's purported, you know, I think if you sample different prisons, you're going to get different numbers, but it's the numbers between 50 and 70% of the prison population has dyslexia. And so these children that come through the grades and they are not served experience, not only are they not performing as their peers are, but they also, especially boys, males, can really become embarrassed. They can become very ashamed and embarrassed. And then they'll act out, and then they will, and this is, you know, this isn't for everyone, but this is just kind of a typical scenario. And then possibly they want to be accepted. So they can either become the class clown, or they may act out, or they may get involved in gang culture. And then they grow past that. So let's just say they go in and out of juvenile detention or something because they're not fitting into the system, to the school system. And then after that, if if they reach adulthood and they're not able to read and they're not able to hold down a job, they've got to make ends meet, not to mention to feel self-worth. So they'll turn to crime.
You know, I've mentioned sometimes when talking to other interviewers that especially men don't know that anger, for example, is a secondary emotion. It's not a primary. They don't know that it's actually responding from fear. And even if it's the fear of maybe feeling a loss of control over some form of security. So a friend of mine might say, um, you think I'm afraid of my wife? And I told him in front of the class, well, yes, you are. That's why you yell at her like you're yelling at me right now, is because you're trying to control the relationship. And so when I see people with anger, it's a control issue, and it's probably coming from a fear-based event, perhaps in our childhood, what we used to call family of origin work. And now they've got all kinds of titles for. So that's huge. 50 to 70% of our male prison population may have dyslexia. And so there's
So
definitely,
no, it's not just male. I mean, it's the prison population.
oh, okay, excellent. And so you've got your four advantages, which certainly shows that we have a lot of work for that you've done in North Carolina and other states. Thank you so much for your efforts in redirecting basically how we are teaching our children. A lot of us are not happy with the education system right now for several reasons. They're still teaching Newtonian science, which has been proven an incorrect theory. And so this is I'm so glad that we're doing this, and I want to help promote your work because this is our home. This is our children's home. And I like to take care of our home, the earth, and I like to take care of our children, right?
Me too. I agree.
So where I want to ask you, where do you see your work going with this? You're working on a business launch for yourself and for the people of the world, for the parents. And what are you doing right now? You're teaching parents and to help teach their children. And what else are you doing right now?
So right now, I've had this business that I currently have for the last 13 years where I work one-on-one with individual students. And because of the pandemic, I'm able to reach people all across the country, even in Puerto Rico. But I am ready to help more people and scale more people. So in January, I will launch a course called Your Child Has Dyslexia, Now What? And it's to help parents just get a footing. Now, it will be almost like a launch pad for them. It's a 6-module course, and they can take each course or each module and go as it basically is an introduction into how to talk to the schools, the different vocabulary, their law, their rights, as well as self-esteem and how to encourage and boost self-worth and self-image in their children. So it's almost, what I've done is I've taken the last 13 years of personal experience as well as professional experience and just bundled it into this little package just to inform parents what could be coming down the pike. Look at it. This may or may not apply to you. If just even one area applies to you, it will save you time and money. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. I also have a meditation course for calming the children's nerves down. A lot of children don't even want to go to school. They're pulled out, and then they're homeschooled. So there's a lot of anxiety there, not being able to perform like other students. So that's one. I am in the process of creating another course, much more in depth for adults that would also be available to prisoners, to help them with their reading and spelling.
I'd like to point out, I interviewed recently at the local school. I wanted to see what they were teaching, what they were doing. And one of the teachers he said he had an incredible way of getting the class's attention. And I was shocked that they even allow this in school. He was putting on the screen gaming, some kind of game. And he said, it works great. I said, are you sure that's legal to do that in class? You're bringing gaming into the children's classroom? I said, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. And my personal opinion. And he said, well, I'm going to do it more. So I did have a talk with the school who are reviewing that. What do you think of that? I don't think that's the meditation that you're talking about.
So the meditation is to calm people down. Now, as far as gaming is concerned, that we do have a generation of gamers. And if you can gamify any curriculum, any instruction, I think it's beneficial. Now, I don't think it should be the primary focus. I think it should be a support, right?
Got it.
I think it should be a support to, for example, learning to read. And it's interesting that you're saying that. And I'm in the process of trying to gamify my curriculum.
Yep. And this is me in acceptance.
As a support to my students and my parents and other people.
Okay. Got it. My daughter is, she's going on 25 now, and I raised her on my own until she was about 5, and then she went to her mother's. And when she would come over, she would have like a Game Boy, and I would say, okay, that's going to stay in your suitcase until you go back home. So I definitely come from a different generation. I'm in my 60s now. Yeah.
Sure, I'm 55, and I believe that it's best to be out in nature and to stay in the clouds and the leaves. And yet we are competing with these games that socially and emotionally make the child feels that they're winning. They get better with repetition. So there are if you can look at it two different ways. There's a lot of benefit to gaming if it's used properly.
Okay.
So a child could feel very successful, especially if what they're learning is something valuable rather than collecting coins, you know, um, right? And so there are so many games out there, and many, many games are not good games. You know, they're
Mhm.
shooting, killing, and I actually have a couple of students, and I can tell that they game often, and I think it does hurt the focus.
Sure.
Um, and yet I think there's a time and a place for it.
Okay.
So it's, you
Okay.
know, yeah, there's, I mean, just like, I don't know. Do you remember back in the day where, I don't know, my mom would say,
We
no,
can say that back in the day because we're not 19 years old. Thank you.
yeah,
Go
yes,
ahead.
that the, you know, you can only watch an hour of television. And it was, for me, it was cartoons on Saturday
Right.
morning, right? From
Mhm.
11 to 12 or whatever it was. And we just didn't have that many options. But sure enough, right after the cartoons were over, we would go right out and play outside all day
I was
long.
in the
And
woods all day long with my brothers and sisters. Yes. And I cherish that so much.
so I
Um,
think that there needs to be a balance.
can you see the date? One of the biggest dangers I see is medications. So here are all these children who are very potentially being misdiagnosed and put on medications for ADHD. And I'm against any kind of Western medicine. Basically, I've been taught, raised a whole different way between my parents and the South Koreans about healing ourselves holistically. So do you see a lot of that going on and the dangers of that? And
I
we really need a heads up about that.
I do. So that's why I push so hard for screening. And that's the first thing that I'll say to any parent. If their child is struggling to read, they really need to go to someone who's reputable that can screen them for what's called a specific learning disability. Now, dyslexia, the term dyslexia, is not recognized in the school system. And there's a reason for that. Dyslexia is a medical term, and the school system, they're not doctors. So they don't have to honor that necessarily. What they do have to do legally is they have to provide what's called FAPE. It's called free and appropriate public education. And they're mandated by law to provide that. And so what the school system will do is they will assess the child, and if they qualify for services, and they're, for example, the child is not performing as well as everyone else in school, or, in math or in reading, then they'll give them a label, or it's a label of specific learning disability. And if somebody receives a specific learning disability, then they could either have what's called an IEP, an individual education plan, or they could have accommodations. Again, it's another law. It's the 504 Disabilities Act.
Okay.
So, but what does happen is if a child is not screened for a possible learning uh, disability, again, the reason I'm stumbling a little bit is because it's only a disability if they're not taught properly.
Right.
If a child
Thank you.
is taught to read, then it's no longer a disability. It's only a disability if they're not. So I have a hard time with disability and disable, or
Mm.
or disorder. I don't care for those labels, just because it's kind of only if a child is identified and then they figure out, oh, they need explicit instruction rather than medicine, they'll be better off.
And when I go into I do speaker meetings sometimes. When I go to a drug and alcohol recovery center, for example, center, and whether it's men's or women's, and I give a speech on identities, how to change your identity. I love to tell people what I was taught by Peter Sage is labels are not put on with super glue. They're put on with Velcro. We can
Yes,
throw them away.
yes,
If they're
yes.
calling you ADHD or dyslexic or even many other what might be termed as disabilities, autistic children. I started playing the piano when I was very young.
Can I speak to that? There's there,
Yes.
there's a man named Dr. Emmanuel Casanova in Greenville, South Carolina, and he wrote a white paper. Now, it's been a while since I've read this. I've held on to this information because I find it fascinating. I've
Okay.
talked about this in front of various audiences, and typically I'll have at least one person telling me that somebody they know has dyslexia and autism. But let me explain what Dr. Casanova found. He discovered that if you have this bell curve, so I'm drawing it right here. I want you to see it. If you've got this bell curve, people who have autism are on this end of the spectrum, and people who have dyslexia are on literally the opposite end of the spectrum.
Okay.
But what happens, and I can go into the neuroscience behind that if you'd like, but what happens is both categories look like they're having trouble reading, and while they look, it looks like the same issue, and then those different groups of people are placed into what's called special education, or exceptional children, but they actually they learn very differently. So people who have autism have what, well, Dr. Casanova discovered they have small mini columns that are tightly packed together. And people who have dyslexia have tall mini columns that are widely spaced. And between these mini columns are these lines, almost like telephone wires, between the two poles. And because people who have dyslexia have taller mini columns that are more widely spaced, we get big picture, larger concepts, where people who have autism are typically able to figure out the details and what's missing in a puzzle piece. We have very neurodiverse brains, and autism is on one end and dyslexia is on the other, but it can look like the inability to read or to comprehend. However, they're for two different reasons.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? So the way
Oh,
people who have dyslexia learn is if you give them the gist first, you give them the big picture first, and then you go in and you dissect it, it makes a lot more sense to people who have dyslexia. Now, if you did that to someone who has autism, it could possibly be overwhelming. So what people who have autism need, again, this is according to Dr. Casanova's research. I don't want to open myself up for criticism. I didn't do the
okay.
research, but the people who have autism tend to learn better piece by piece by piece. So like if you think of a pizza, if you give one slice at a time, they can create the whole, where people who have dyslexia, it's the opposite. They need the picture of the big pizza first, and then they pull out the separate pieces and they learn those individual pieces.
Well, that makes total sense to me. I mean, I can really see that happening with people in my life. People who are autistic. I've met children who, for example, I would play the piano and I never learned to play the piano. I taught myself. Anybody who knows how to play the piano knows I don't know how to play the piano. But if they don't know how to play the piano, I look like a maestro. I'm just rolling up and down the keyboards. So if you hit one key on a piano, boom, you learn that note. Whether a dyslexic might just whoop down the whole board, get the big picture of all the the
I like that analogy.
whatever
Yeah,
they call them.
I like that. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example because I noticed that people learn to play the piano very differently, if they're not on, some strict course. That is so beautiful.
So people
I want
who
to
have,
ask you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, people who have dyslexia learn from the top down. It's called the top down. And as they go through their different grades and even higher education. Higher education tends to be easier for people who have dyslexia if they've been remediated. And remediated, that word comes from the word remedy. So if somebody has had a remedy to fix their reading struggles, then
Okay.
they've been remediated. And people who, are remediated and they get into these higher levels of education, it's easier because the concepts are bigger and it makes
Right.
more sense to them. And then they're thinking outside the box, where people with autism learn from the bottom up. So, and I don't want to invalidate anybody's struggles, but it can be easier to learn those individual sounds for someone who
Right.
has autism
Right.
versus someone who has dyslexia. So,
And I'd also like to point out that back in the 60s, when we had all these politically incorrect words, I don't think ADHD, the term existed. It was my parents sent me to a therapist, a couple of different therapists, who eventually, because I see spirits and people's auras and whatnot since I was a child, and the therapist told me, well, Raphael, maybe it's better if you just keep it to yourself, okay? So they
sure.
have this suppression, but at the same time, this therapist told my parents that I had something what they call the warrior personality, which I think is a direct association with ADHD.
It is. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
They're
I don't
trying
think the word existed back then, the acronym.
I think they're, well, and this could be a whole other conversation.
Yeah,
I think that people who that have a hard time staying focused here in their body right now need just, it's like a muscle to be embodied, to be in your body and to
the
express
exercise,
your body. So my personal belief is that we're infinite beings having a human experience.
of course.
Well, it makes sense to you and me, but a lot of people haven't thought of it that way. And so if we're infinite and we're here learning in our bodies and expressing,
Welcome to Earth School.
I know for some it could be really challenging. And
And
I'm
that's
not
the name of my course, Welcome to Life on Earth School. That's what I'm teaching now. Thank you.
good.
Infinite beings having an learning experience. And it sounds almost like, Linda, like you're talking about how important it is for us to have grounding practices.
Yes. Yes. So if we can ground the students, all students, especially this generation that's coming through. I don't even know how that sounds, but especially this generation that's here right now.
Here we are.
Um, I think the benefit of grounding is tremendous. And then if someone truly does struggle with reading, then they can be taught explicitly. Our brains are rewirable. We are this very malleable. Now, the data and the science says it's best to grab the students before third grade and really start working with them then, because the malleability kind of starts to slow down after third grade.
Developing cognitive synapses, pathways.
Absolutely. And but the thing within the school system, from kindergarten to third grade, children are being taught to read. And then by the end of third grade, there is an assessment across the country, end of grade test, and they end up, some students need to be held back or they don't perform as well. And then going forward, fourth on, children are learning through reading, by reading.
Hmm.
They're learning by text
Mm,
rather than learning to read, they're learning through reading.
right.
And so if a child has not mastered that skill, they're set up for struggles later. The only problem is that first or kindergarten through third grade, when teachers are teaching students to read, not every school is doing it based on the science of reading. So that's a whole other topic. And actually, if anybody wants to listen to what I'm talking about, a woman named Emily Hanford through American Public Media did a 6-series podcast called Sold a Story. And she is phenomenal. I love her too. I love that woman. And she has done so much good to raise awareness.
Sold Story, SOLD.
Sold a Story. And
Oh, sold a story. Oh, yeah.
she
Nice.
goes deep into, and especially during the pandemic, that really exposed a lot of school systems in New York and Chicago and California, big school systems that were not teaching their children to read. And the parents were at home and they were witnessing it. So it's a really good podcast.
This is huge. Linda, how can parents and people get a hold of you? Where can they find you in your training and
Sure.
where to get direction for their children?
My website is called dyslexiastuff.com.
Dyslexiastuff.com. Yeah, that's simple. And tell us what's on your website, dyslexiastuff.com.
So it's very new. It's very, very new.
Okay.
It's very new, but I do have one of my courses that is currently in the process of being edited. I'm taking imperfect action. I know you know what that means.
Oh yeah. Progress, not perfection.
Yeah, just trying to help people. But I also have written a book called Susie the Struggling Reader, and that addresses, it's really meant for parents to read to their children. It's not an easy reader for children to read themselves,
Got
but
it.
it's very informative, and it is meant to empower the child as well, to show them that their self-esteem is not based on their ability to read. So you can go to my website and you can download that book for free, and just plug your email in and I'll get back in touch with you. So that is one way to get in touch with me.
Excellent. So you can go to dyslexiastuff.com and download the ebook. Is that correct?
Yes.
Susie the Struggling Reader. Um,
Perfect.
Excellent. And is that also available on Amazon in hard copy or
Thank you. Yes, it is. And it'll be
excellent?
in Walmart and Target in the coming months.
And I certainly hope so. And if there's anything I can do to make sure it comes into Walmart and Target, then you let me know, Linda. Do you have any other contact that you'd like to share, email or anything like that for people and collaborators?
So, well, my email address is linda.dyslexiastuff@gmail.com.
Linda.dyslexiastuff@gmail.com. Go figure. Excellent. Linda and I are in Kane and Lexia's some of their groups together. They're from Silicon Valley. Well, Lexia's from Italy, and they do branding and business challenges and basically how to promote this beautiful message, this very important message that Linda has for the world, for parents and people and students, individuals in our world today. And it's right now, this is one of the hugest issues I've run across that is so important that we address and deeply and now, deeply and quickly.
I
So
agree.
you can go to Dyslexia.
Thank you so much for raising awareness. Like a little earth angel. I appreciate it.
And you know what? I'm looking so much forward. I would love to do a podcast with you based on specific information we discussed in the future. So let's get together. And for now, go to dyslexiastuff.com and read Susie the Struggling Reader. And let's help raise the awareness of this because this is huge. This is important. And thank you so much for your work, Linda.
Thank you. So can I say one more thing?
Oh, yes.
So one of the things that I would really love to see is I would, if someone downloads the book or purchases the book on Amazon, if they like it and they feel that it would be helpful to buy one and put it in their pediatrician's office. Because a lot of pediatricians don't even know what dyslexia is.
Wow. How is that possible?
Very possible.
You know, there's something I notice about you. You have this habit of stating things that just blow me away. Wow, pediatricians don't know about dyslexia.
I think it's
Wow.
better. I think it's getting better.
Hmm.
My pediatrician ended up coming to me, and it's interesting because the woman or the people that misdiagnosed my children also refer people to me now. So these are the doctors that once told me that that misdiagnosed my child now send and refer people to me. So I think the awareness is definitely being elevated, and we're talking about it more, and I've definitely been talking about it for the last 13 years.
Yeah.
But just there's so many more people that I interact with on a daily basis that are struggling.
Yes, and that's why I'm so glad to have met you. Now, in our group of people in our AI groups and whatnot, some of them have a larger message than others. And the larger message you have, the more you are going to gain support. And so I just want to invite everybody who can support Linda's cause to go to dyslexiastuff.com and help bring our children into this beautiful world. Thank you, Linda. And I
Thank
look
you.
forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.